Today is the day we make history.
You're never going to be able to participate in a caucus, cast a vote that's going to have this much punch.
Even if you vote and then pass away, it's worth it, remember?
The Republican candidates are making their final appeals as Iowans brave sub-zero temperatures to caucus for their Republican primary candidate. A wind chill warning is in effect, and there's some concern that the weather today could impact tonight's turnout. The Des Moines Register NBC News Iowa poll shows former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley is cutting into former President Donald Trump's commanding lead. 40% of Iowans say they identify with Trump's Make America Great Again. Thank you for joining us this hour for America's Vote 2024, the Iowa Caucus. Joining me now is Scott Tranter from Decision Desk HQ. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Look, former President Donald Trump is heading into tonight's caucuses with a very comfortable 34-point lead, but as your data has shown over the past months, Nikki Haley has been creeping up on him. What should we expect from tonight?
Well, I think we should expect a battle for second place. As you pointed out, Nikki Haley, mid-September, was sitting at about 8 points, a distant third behind Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. As of today, the polling averages have her 2 points ahead, Ron DeSantis in second place. So she clearly has the momentum. It's pretty clear to us that Donald Trump is the clear favorite at number one, but who comes out second out of Iowa is going to have the momentum going into New Hampshire and maybe enough money to go all the way to Super Tuesday.
And look, the answer to that question is going to largely lay in turnout for today, obviously. That's really important when you're talking about caucuses. There's, of course, some inclement weather in Iowa right now, sub-zero temperatures, a ton of snow. Which candidates have the most enthusiastic supporters who are definitely going to be caucusing tonight despite the weather conditions?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the weather. In 2016, it was 47 degrees on caucus night, and they had record turnout at 186,000. Our projections right now put it at between 150 and 170,000, so a little bit below 2016's record because, you know, Iowans are pretty hardy. They know what they're doing. They know what they're getting out for. But if we look at enthusiasm, and which is always a tough thing to measure, Donald Trump's supporters are very enthusiastic for him, and his detractors are very enthusiastic against him. And so that's where it'll be interesting. It looks like between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, they both have the most enthusiastic supporters. Nikki Haley does have the momentum, though. But between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, I think they're going to be battling it out for that rural vote and will have an advantage if there's a lower turnout.
Sticking on the topic of Trump and Iowa, he, of course, sees significant support from evangelicals in Iowa. But that's not, you know, that is not exactly the makeup of the electorate when you talk about somewhere like New Hampshire. So, of course, after tonight, the main focus is going to be on New Hampshire. Talk about the differences in voters between those two extremely key states.
Well, it's interesting. Iowa, a pretty bread and butter Midwestern state, good mix of evangelical, not evangelical, working class, college educated, depending on where you are in the state. New Hampshire, classical Northeastern state, highly educated, a little bit above the average median income. And New Hampshire does have a unique rule. If you're an independent, you can vote in either primary, the Democratic or Republican. There is not a contested Democratic primary. So you might see a lot of independent voters bring some of their more moderate views into the Republican primary. And that's why Nikki Haley has been surging there and is second at 30% and certainly has a momentum. So that's why she's looking forward to coming out of Iowa, at least in a competitive place, and then really see if she can overtake Trump in New Hampshire in a week.
Yes, sticking on the topic of New Hampshire, we sort of saw a curveball in the race last week with Chris Christie ending his presidential bid. He, of course, saw pretty, significant, pretty fair numbers in New Hampshire. Who are his supporters going to now? And I know there's been a lot of speculation that Nikki Haley will pick up those Christie supporters. Is that what the data is saying?
So it's interesting. We looked at it, at least from a national sense, which isn't specific to New Hampshire, but about half of Chris Christie's supporters do go to Nikki Haley. The other half go somewhere else. Now, what's interesting is when he dropped out, he was polling at about 6%, which was only a few points below what he got when he ran in New Hampshire and said he was going to win it in 2016. Obviously, that didn't pan out for him. Him getting out impacts the race, but I would put it this way. His supporters were probably going to bleed away even if you were on the ticket. It's going to be more interesting what happens to those independents in New Hampshire. Do they decide to come out and vote in the Republican primary, which they don't normally do?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it gets into the conversation of how Iowa is so different from New Hampshire and truthfully from all the other states as well. Look, when we talk about tonight's race, when it's really a race for second place between Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, I know you've been poring over the data and the numbers. Tell us what the difference is between Haley supporters and DeSantis supporters.
So DeSantis supporters, by and large, let's look at it from a lens of who they would support if they didn't support their respective candidate, right? So Ron DeSantis supporters, if they don't have him to vote for, the majority of them go to Donald Trump. Whereas Nikki Haley is the majority of her supporters, if they don't have her to go to, they're not voting in the Republican primary, or they're going to Ron DeSantis or something else. They're certainly not going to Donald Trump. So if we look at it from that lens, Nikki Haley's supporters are more moderate establishment Republicans, whereas Ron DeSantis supporters are more in line with the new Trump movement, which happens to be a little bit more populist, more middle class, and evangelical.
And now if we can bring former President Trump into this conversation, of course, in 2023, he saw 4 different indictments. All of them didn't really affect him in the polls unless it actually helped his numbers go up. He didn't really take a hit after any of that. Looking at these numbers, looking at the electorate, and as we now see his schedule for the next year, which is going to include crisscrossing the nation, both for campaign events and for court appearances, do you foresee those court appearances and these legal matters affecting him in the polls as he continues with this presidential campaign?
Well, the only legal experience I have is watching a few episodes of Law and Order, so I won't speak to any of the legal aspect here. But what I will say is this, is every time there's an indictment, he sees a jump in the polls among his core supporters. And while his core supporters aren't enough for him to win an election outright, they are the ones that fund his campaign. He's had some pretty good fundraising quarters, especially around some of these indictments. So that is a good fuel for him throughout the primary and into the general. We did see a New York Times Siena poll come out that had some interesting data on what would happen if he got convicted. And if he got convicted, there are a significant amount of swing voters, namely independents in key states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, that would change their vote or say, you know what, I'm not going to consider Donald Trump anymore. So that's where it is. I'm not sure where all these court cases are going to end up. I do know, though, the data shows if he's convicted, it does impact swing voters.
A massive wild card as we head into this 2024 presidential election. Scott Tranter from Decision Desk HQ, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next hour with another update on America's Vote 2024.